Давайте, наверное, тогда начнем. Здравствуйте еще раз. Еще раз представлюсь. Меня зовут Тасель Шкубарова. Я являюсь менеджером по развитию отношений в ACCA Центральной Азии, Армении и Монголии. Сегодня у нас второй день вебинара, и он будет касаться совершенствования оценок. Мы расскажем, как экзаменационная команда создает вопросы для экзаменов, дадим вам определенные советы. Выступать будет моя коллега из Великобритании, Дэниел Эванс. Она официально ее позиция Qualification Content Manager, что переводится менеджер по содержанию квалификации. So Daniel, thank you for joining, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me this morning. I'm really pleased to be here to talk to you about designing exams and writing effective questions, whether they be long case studies or multiple choice questions or a combination of the two. As Asel mentioned, I think I'm the qualification content manager for the ACCA qualification. So my job involves managing the ACCA tax exams that we offer both for the UK tax syllabus and also all the variant tax exams around the world that we offer. And I also manage the Ethics and Professional Skills module, or EPSM. Prior to being with ACCA, I worked for Kaplan Publishing, and alongside teaching, we also wrote exam content for ACCA, AAT, ICAEW, and also CIMA as well. But most of my time was spent writing for ACCA tax exams. So today we've got roughly 2 hours together to talk about how we write effective questions, whether they're MCQs or whether they're longer questions. It is intended to be an interactive session, so if anything I say raises a question for you, then please do put that in the chat box. Hopefully someone can either translate it for me, or I've got Google Translate open in the background, so just in case I can translate it as well. So the aim is for the session to be as useful and practical for you as possible, so please do put any questions that you have in the chat box as we go through. So first of all, today's agenda. We're going to start off by looking at the exam creation process. Although we will spend the majority of the time talking about writing effective questions and best practice for this, it's essential that we talk about the process first of all, because it's only when the questions are written within a holistic and well-managed process that they will actually be effective as an assessment measure. We'll then move on to what will be most of the session, which is how we write effective multiple choice questions and also those longer case study questions. And at the end, we'll touch on how we review the exam after it's happened and how we improve future exams. So first of all, let's look at the exam creation process. So different bodies will have many different processes that they use to create exam content. What you can see on the slide here is a simplified ACCA process map. We're not going to go through this in detail, as you might be relieved, because there is quite a lot on this slide. And indeed, a lot of the steps that you see on this slide wouldn't be needed by other bodies, because ACCA, due to its size and the global nature, particularly around marking, we do have a lot of steps in our process that we won't be discussing today. So please don't copy this and think that you have to replicate it, but it just gives you an example to show you a few really key points. So the first one is that there are actually stages before you write your exam content. This is thinking about what that content needs to look like, and this would be in the form of an assessment strategy and then a blueprint. Don't worry if those terms are not familiar to you, because we're going to discuss those in detail in a moment. Also, I'd like to point out here that there are various review stages. So these review stages will consider different things like the technical accuracy of the questions, the clarity of the questions, the difficulty level, the time it would take a learner to sit the question, and so on. At each review stage, there'll be different people involved and they will have a different remit, and updates should be made to the content after each of these stages. And the final thing I want to point out is that it is actually a cyclical process rather than a linear one. So once we've written an exam, the students have attempted it, we've marked it, we'll then use how that went to improve future assessments. So we're always looking at this iterative process of writing, sitting, improving for the next time. So although we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about how to write good questions, let's start with a step back from that and look at the assessment strategy and how to structure an exam. So this section is going to look at the stage before we start writing any of the questions, where we want to work out at a very high level what our exam is going to look like. It's really worth spending sufficient time at this stage, because even the best written questions in the world are not going to be effective if they're not really testing what you need them to at the right level. It also ensures that our exam is consistent so that students know what to expect. So assessment strategy. At this stage, we need to ask a lot of questions, as you'll see on the board, to determine the parameters of our assessment. So first of all, do we even want an exam? Is that the most appropriate way to test the content? There might be other ways to assess the competence, and some of these are shown on the slide. So it could be a group assessment, it could be workplace experience. It's better to assess what you're looking to test. Do we have any restrictions on what the assessment has to look like? Perhaps there are legal or regulatory requirements which might dictate the structure of our exam. What systems do we need to have in place to ensure that the exam is of the right quality? What review stages might we need? Who do we need to be involved? Where does the assessment sit in terms of any wider learning? So, for example, in ACCA, our assessment strategy changes between each of the levels of our qualification. So the questions that we use at a lower level are quite different to the questions that we use at higher levels. And similarly, with a university degree, the assessment approach will change as students progress through their studies. Who's going to be involved in creating the exam, and what experience do they have? What experience do they need? Will they cope well with the type of questions that they need to write? Then we get on to the more practical aspects of how does your exam need to work? Is it going to be on computer or is it going to be on paper? Is it sat in a physical exam hall? Do you want people to be able to take anything in to work with in the exam? For example, will they have something like tax tables where they have some information? Will they be able to take their textbooks in with them? Because that's going to impact profoundly on how you write the exam. The main rule that we need to always remember at this stage is that the assessment should be appropriate to test the syllabus at the intended educational level. And we'll come back to that later. So answering those questions at the outset will have quite a significant impact on lots of things. So it's worth understanding the consequences before making all of these decisions. So it's important to think more than one exam session ahead. Think about the amount of time that will be needed for writing the content and marking the content, and that will be dictated by the assessment chosen. For instance, if they're multiple choice questions, you might be able to get a computer to mark that automatically. If there's lots of longer questions, they'll need to be marked by actual people. So you'll need to be able to work backwards from the exam date to ensure that there's enough time for all of the required stages to create your exam. You need to think about the cost. A real difference in cost will be if you choose a paper exam versus a computer-based exam, because you obviously will need those IT systems in place in order to support your computer-based exam and deliver it reliably, versus the printing cost of a paper exam. You need to think about your staff skills. Do you have the right people? Do you need different people in order to create this exam? Do they need more training? You need to think about the academic levels that you're assessing and the requirements of those. Are you going to create new content for each exam, or are you reusing some of the content from previous sessions? It's more secure to create new content every time, but it's more time consuming and more expensive. How will assessments be updated in line with updates in the underlying course and the syllabus? The production schedule definitely needs to allow for this. This is something that is very dear to my heart because I'm a tax person. And therefore all of our exams, the syllabus will change every year in line with the tax legislation in particular countries, whereas something like performance management or accounting, they don't change as much. So it's not as much work to update that syllabus every year usually. So based on your chosen strategy, you might want or need to train or employ more people, start or stop using certain systems, and potentially secure additional budget in order to create your exam. So now we know at a high level how we want the exam to be structured. The next step is to establish the next level of detail of exactly what our particular exam is going to look like. So I'm going to call this structure of the exam blueprint. And all that means is we're just taking the assessment strategy down to a more practical level. Again, we've got lots of questions here to think about, such as those included on the screen. So we need to think about how long our exam will be, which type of exam questions we're going to include. Is it open or closed book? Are all the questions going to be compulsory, or are we providing students with a choice of which ones to answer? How many sections are there going to be? How many questions in each section? What will the pass mark be? Are they going to be given any pre-seen information? And are there going to be any professional skills marks? So marks for the students in terms of the way they answer the questions rather than the technical content of their answer. The end result will give you a good idea of what your exam will look like. And I'm going to show you some examples in a minute from ACCA exams. Some people use prescription as a term for this stage, but for ACCA, we call a prescription something different, which is setting out what is going to be in a particular exam rather than the rules about what is in each exam. And we're going to come on to that in a few slides' time. So let's have a look at a few examples of blueprints from the ACCA qualification. So these are shared with learners and they're absolutely not a secret. We want our learners to know about this part. So our first example is from financial accounting, or FA. And this is from our applied skills level of the ACCA qualification. So it's that middle level that a lot of our ACCA students will start at. So financial accounting is a 2-hour computer-based examination. It's got 35 objective test questions worth 2 marks each, otherwise known as multiple choice questions mainly. We've then got our section B, which has 2 15-mark multitask questions or case study questions. And they're going to test consolidation and accounts preparation. And the pass mark is 50%. So we're setting out for our writers the structure of the exam. We're also providing our students and any tutors as well with an expectation of what the exam should look like. Moving on, we've now got the blueprint from Strategic Business Leader, or SBL. Now, this comes from our strategic professional level of the ACCA qualification, so our highest level that we test. So what we've got is quite a different blueprint. So first of all, there's some pre-seen information, which is released 2 weeks before the exam sitting. It's a computer-based assessment again, so similar to FA. It's an integrated case study. So it doesn't have lots of individual questions. It's one big question. Students have 3 hours and 15 minutes, including their reading and planning time. It has 3 compulsory tasks, but 100 marks in total. 20 of the marks are available for professional skills marks. So this is different to FA, where they're all technical marks. But once again, the pass mark is 50%. So here, the focus is now on the higher level skills of synthesis and evaluation, and students being able to go beyond basic knowledge to really thinking through an issue from different angles, pulling together bits of information and making judgments to formulate real world appropriate advice. So we'll now move on to the structure of the exam and some high level considerations when we're coming to the writing stage. And we're coming back to this golden rule that it's essential that there's a match between the syllabus and the exam. If you look at the learning outcomes in the ACCA syllabus for the 2 exams we've just looked at, you'll be able to see that there's different verbs and educational levels being used, which mirrors the different exam formats. As well as level, though, it's essential that the exam tests the syllabus with both appropriate breadth and depth. It's impossible to test everything, but it needs to be spread enough so that we're testing in enough detail on some areas, but also getting good syllabus coverage. You also should check at this point if your exam makes sense in any wider context. So do you have a progression between any levels of a qualification like the ACCA does? Or are the exams all at one level of consistent difficulty so that we need to make sure that they are comparable and one isn't more difficult than others? The last step before we get on to writing is to have a prescription for the upcoming exam or a particular set of questions. So remember I said earlier that some people refer to the blueprint as being the prescription, but at ACCA we don't. So a prescription will only apply to a particular exam. So whatever type of exam you have, it's best practice to keep a rolling syllabus mapping, which sounds like a really complicated phrase, but all it is a list of the learning outcomes or topics which have been tested in each exam session, so that you can look back and you can see what you've done before. Because in an upcoming exam, you may want to avoid topics which have been tested very recently, but also you might want to make sure students can't question spot by following a pattern or seeing what has or hasn't been tested recently. It could also be useful to identify topics which haven't been tested, which means you could either test them or consider removing them from the syllabus if you feel like they're not going to be tested. It's also a good way to look at a glance to make sure the same approach is being taken over time. For example, the same number of syllabus areas being tested for about the same number of marks each. If you have an exam which you're not writing fresh every time, you may be taking questions from a wider bank of questions. If you are doing this, you want to make sure that the overall exam comes out looking sensible every time you do it. So you should have some sort of rules or algorithm to govern the balance of the questions that you take from that bank every time. These rules might contain prescribed learning outcomes or topics which you definitely want to appear each time. It should also make sure that you have a similar narrative computational split, if that applies to your exam, bearing in mind how long certain types of questions take to answer. Because depending on the subject, students might find narrative versus computational questions easier, or they might find them quicker or longer to answer. So we want to make sure we've got a consistent balance so that each exam is fair. We also don't want to allow lots of questions on the same topic area. So that's the same point as before on breadth and depth. We don't want half of the multiple choice questions coming from one syllabus area, which some students may be very good at, some students not good at. So it's not very fair to do that. We also, something that I've come across before, we don't want one question to give them the answer to another question. So it's another thing to bear in mind, that you don't want certain questions appearing together, because it could do that. Okay, so I've been talking for a while now, and we haven't got on to how to actually write effective questions, which was the title of my presentation. So I think we should start doing that now by looking at multiple choice questions and other types of objective testing as well. And this is what we're going to be doing for the majority of the rest of the session, talking about different kinds of questions. So we're going to talk about what makes a good or a bad MCQ, as well as some other types of similar objective test questions, which can be used as well or instead of your traditional multiple choice question. So when I'm talking about an MCQ, I'm really talking about one specific type of objective test questions. Objective test questions, more broadly, are a type of question which has a definite right or wrong answer or answers, and which we often give learners options to select from. So what that means is the knowledge being tested has to be really, really precise, because there's no opportunity for the students to write freely about what they understand about the topic or how they interpret the question. They have to be able to select the correct answer based on the information that we give them. So it really is a test of that precise knowledge, and we need to make sure students have enough information in order to do that. So the most common type of objective test question is on the screen now, and we're asking a learner to select one correct answer from 4 possible choices. So there are lots of parts to an MCQ, and they are all surprisingly important. So first of all, we have the statement. So this is the part right at the top. We don't always have this because it's not always needed. And it could be just narrative, it could be just numerical, or it could be both. This one here is just narrative. There's no numbers involved. This provides the information needed for the students to answer the question. So here we're telling students that a manufacturing company benchmarks the performance of its accounts receivable department with that of a leading credit card company. So we're introducing students to what the question is about. We're giving them the information that they're going to need to answer the question. We've then got the prompt, and this is the actual question that we're asking. You could either have this as a question, which is what we've got here, and the approach that ACCA take. So we'll always have a question mark at the end of it. If it's not appropriate to have a question mark, then it isn't phrased correctly to be a question. But we could also phrase it as a requirement with a suitable verb. So here we've got which type of benchmarking is the company using, but we could change it to identify which of the following types of benchmarking the company is using. So changing it from a question to a requirement. Either of these are fine, and it's just a style choice in your exam, but it really should be consistent both throughout an individual exam and through different sessions of the exam, so that students understand the format of the questions they're going to see. We then have the correct answer, which in this case is functional benchmarking. And we also have the distractors, which are essentially the incorrect answers. And they are really key to a good question. So we'll be talking more about those in a minute. Distractors, sometimes people don't know what that means. It's just essentially the incorrect answers that we're using to distract the students a little bit from the correct answer. So although multiple choice questions look very simple, and students often think they're very simple, it's very, very easy to write bad multiple choice questions. And I remember this very well because when I first started writing exam content for CAPLAN on ACCA exams, there were no multiple choice questions for the applied skills level. And during that time, ACCA introduced multiple choice questions. So we had to create hundreds of multiple choice questions to go in the exam tuition books and revision books. And it's only when you start to write them that you realise quite how difficult they are to get them precise enough to be fair to the students, and not too difficult either, because students can't explain to you how they've interpreted the question. So they need to be able to be really clear about what the correct answer is. So on that basis, I want to spend some time talking you through what makes a good multiple choice question with the prompts on the screen now. So first of all, it has to test the learning outcome. This might sound really obvious, but each multiple choice question has to actually be testing a particular learning outcome from your syllabus. It mustn't go beyond the depth within the learning outcome either. So for example, if you have a learning outcome which says that learners only need to have an awareness of a particular calculation, you couldn't then test them on performing the calculation, as that is beyond what you've said they need to be able to do. Besides not being fair because they might not be prepared, it would also give an advantage to your more able students who might be able to do that versus your less able students who wouldn't be able to do it. So it's helpful to make sure as well that you're using good taxonomy and appropriate verbs here. So identify, calculate, for example, if you're using that requirement style of asking the question. This is along similar lines to the point on the screen about learning materials. Learners should be able to answer all the questions based on the learning support resources they've had access to. It's in fact a really useful step in the review process to make sure each question can be linked back to a particular part of the learning materials to make sure it's something learners have seen before. If it isn't, you should either make a change to the question or a change to the learning materials in good time so that students will have seen it before the exam. Next, let's have a think about positive and negative questions. A positive question might ask which one of 4 answers is correct, whilst a negatively phrased question might ask which one is incorrect. That's actually a harder question, as learners need to consider each of the answers rather than just looking for the correct one. They can also forget that it's a negative question and end up looking for the correct answer, which might be there, rather than the incorrect answer. So you have to be careful to limit the amount of negative questions that are being included in an exam. Some institutes will have a policy of avoiding them altogether because they are more difficult. It can, however, be a way if you've got something that's quite an easy question and you want to make it more difficult, you could ask in a negative way. This point about questions taking roughly the same length of time to answer is important, particularly if you're pulling questions from a larger bank, as we discussed earlier, using those rules or algorithms. If some of the questions are much quicker than others to read and answer, you could end up with a much easier or a much harder exam to complete on any given day. This is sometimes difficult, particularly if your subject has a mixture of narrative and computational questions, because narrative ones are usually quicker for the students to answer. This is something to bear in mind when thinking about your algorithm, as we were talking about earlier. Another aspect to consider with the length of the question is how many steps there are in a calculative question. What is a very reasonable calculation can perform really poorly if it has too many steps, as most candidates will go wrong at some point. And with multiple choice questions, there's no partial marks, it's either right or wrong. Whereas in a longer question, most students could score, say, 75% for a calculation. When it's multiple choice, many would fail because they would make a mistake and not arrive at the correct answer. For instance, if we had a calculation with 5 steps, students could go wrong at any one of those 5 steps and therefore not get the question correct, even though they've got the other 4 steps right. So I always look when I'm reviewing a multiple choice question to make sure that there are not too many steps for them to go wrong. Now let's talk about those distractors. As we said, they're key to a good multiple choice question. You want to offer answers which look like they could be correct, but which aren't. This means that in a calculation question, your distractors should be numbers, if it's possible to get by making specific mistakes within the question, which a learner might actually make. Otherwise, a sensible student might be able to spot the right answer or increase their odds by picking from a smaller number of possible options by discounting others. There are a few things to be careful of here. So often writers, if you've got a narrative question, they will pick a distractor that is based on old rules. So something that used to be correct but isn't correct anymore. And I always try to avoid this because it's not fair, because some students might be more aware of those old rules and therefore be more distracted by it compared to a weaker student who isn't aware of those old rules and therefore isn't distracted by that information. You also want to avoid numbers which stand out too much. As students are either likely to think that it's definitely correct because it looks really different to the other numbers, or they'll think it's definitely wrong because it looks so different to the other numbers. In a narrative question, the answer should be plausible sounding, perhaps using opposites, alternatives, or similar other words from that section of the course. But again, you just need to be careful because you don't want them to look too similar so that students get confused and can't see the difference between them. But you also don't want them to be too different in length, because students might think that one that is much shorter can't possibly be correct, or they might think it's definitely correct, or they might think if one is much longer, it's definitely wrong or definitely correct. So we want things that look sort of quite similar, but different enough that students don't get confused between them. So hopefully you've got from this summary here that there really is an art to crafting effective multiple choice questions, and it does take some practice, so it shouldn't be underestimated. And I think it's really important to say that it shouldn't be underestimated by anyone, because the students often underestimate them as well and think they're really easy. And then realise that they've picked all the distractors because they haven't taken long enough and thought carefully enough about the questions. So I think it's a good lesson for everybody that multiple choice questions, we should all take our time. Of course, it's worth just taking a little step back and remembering that multiple choice questions are only one type of objective test question, and there are other types that you might think about using in your assessments. So we've already looked at a traditional multiple choice question, which is where learners pick one correct answer from a given number of options. It's most usually 4, and in ACCA exams, it is 4. One type of multiple choice question that is commonly seen is where students are given, say, 3 statements, and they are asked to pick how many of the statements are correct or incorrect. So it could be all of them, could be numbers 1 and 3, it could be numbers 2 and 4. So we do see a lot of those as well, which can be a bit more challenging for students because they have to think about how many of the statements are correct, not just finding the correct one. What we also see is something called a multiple response question, or an MRQ. And they're slightly different because we're going to still give learners 4 possible answers, but we're going to ask them to select more than one correct answer. And you would always tell them how many correct answers they need to find. So we've got an example on the screen here, which is they might need to pick 2 of the following statements as being correct. Now, to get the marks here, both of the answers need to be correct. So there's no half marks usually for getting one of them right, but one of them wrong. So this can feel quite harsh on the students because even if they've got half of it right, they're still going to score 0. The rest of the setup and the content we've just talked about on best practice still applies for multiple response questions. You need to think carefully here how long it's going to take a student to answer a question if they've got to select more than one correct answer, and if it's of an equivalent difficulty to others in the exam or the question bank. Other things that you might see, particularly if you're running computer-based exams, there's other types of question that become available to you. If you're doing a paper-based exam, you're probably going to be doing MRQs and MCQs because they're the easiest to do on paper. If it's a computer-based exam, you might have a system which is able to cope with different types of questions. And these may involve learners typing a particular word to fill in a blank, or they could be clicking or dragging things around the screen using like drag and drop, or using a drop-down list to select a correct answer. They could be clicking on a certain area of the screen to show their correct answer on perhaps a graph. Now, what these allow you to do is test topics in different ways, which can be appropriate for certain different topics. And it can also appeal to different types of learners a little bit more. However, you do have to be careful because more types of question introduce a higher risk that your questions are not all of a consistent difficulty or standard. Now, fill in the blanks are particularly difficult. And this is something I learned over the time when we introduced these objective test questions for ACCA, because it's very easy to write a question that when you look at the answer, you think, oh, that's actually quite straightforward. The students will be fine with that. But the problem is that they're only getting marks if they come up with exactly the correct answer and put that in the box. They've got no clues about what the correct answer is. So if they make any mistakes, they're not going to get any marks. So for instance, if we had a multiple choice question where the answer was 100 and students calculate the answer to be 900 and, sorry, shouldn't make up numbers on the spot. The answer is 100 and the student comes up with an answer of 95. And when they look at the options, it's closest to 100. They would pick 100 as being their answer because they've just made a small mistake. But with a fill in the blank, they have no option to do that. They're going to put 95 as their answer and they're going to score 0. So you really do need to make sure that a fill in the blank is easier than you would do for a multiple choice question in order for students to arrive at the correct answer, because the method being used to test is harder itself. You also need to make sure that learners have had plenty of opportunity to see and practice all of the types of questions as part of their preparation before they sit the exam. Because what you don't want is students being surprised when they come in and they're not sure how to answer the questions, or they're just really put off by what they see in front of them. So if you haven't put the questions in the learning material in that style, it's not a good idea to do that in exam without wanting them. Okay, I've been talking for quite a while now, so I'm sure everybody would like a little bit of a break from my voice and a chance to get a drink. So can I suggest that we'll take about a 10-minute break? So we'll come back in 10 minutes. If you've got any questions in the meantime, please do feel free to put them in the chat, and I can have a look at them while we're having our break. Okay, so I'll see you in about 10 minutes.
Sure. Дорогие участники, если у вас есть вопросы, пожалуйста, пишите пока в чатах. А сейчас у нас небольшой перерыв, 10 минут. Нургуль, здравствуйте. У нас небольшой перерыв до часа с 51 минуты.
Hello everyone, welcome back. Hope you've had a good break. I'll just get my screen back where I need it to be. Okay, so having looked at multiple choice questions, and we've just looked at what makes a particular multiple choice question good or bad, we're going to move on now to still look at best practice, but this time we're going to look at case study questions, sometimes called just long questions, sometimes called constructed response questions, but essentially we're giving students the ability now to write their own answer rather than just select from the answers that we give them. So we're going to find out that these questions are very different, both to write and also for the students to tackle them in an exam. There's lots of crossover and similarity in terms of the principles that we've already talked about to writing a good question. So let's take a minute to talk about what I mean by a case study question. Oh, can everybody make sure they're muted,
Боржан, убирайте. Видео убирайте? Видео нету? Есть видео.
Okay, thank you. So let's just take a minute to think about what I mean by a case study question. So as we've already said, it's much longer than an MCQ, and it will have more information, which is usually based on a real world style of a scenario rather than being purely just knowledge. The question itself is bigger, more open-ended than the type of questions we see in an MCQ, and it requires learners to answer it in their own way. There's no longer just a single correct answer to select from a list. However, what's really important here is that they can score follow-through marks. So even if they make mistakes and they end up with the incorrect answer at the end, they can score those marks for their workings or for the intermediate steps. And they can't do this in a multiple choice question. So although longer questions can seem more difficult than an MCQ, often this is not the case, and students can often score better on a longer question than they can on multiple choice questions, because it does allow them to make those little mistakes that, you know, we all make when we're attempting calculations or written answers. Quite often we see these case study questions at the higher levels of programs or qualifications. So, for example, within the ACCA qualification, we see them being used at the top level, our strategic professional level. So what you can see on the slide now is a diagram of the ACCA qualification. And we start at the bottom with applied knowledge and the foundations exams, which are mostly objective test questions. We then move on to applied skills, which has a mix of objective test questions and case studies. And then when we get up to strategic professional, there are no longer objective test questions and it is purely case study questions. So there is a progression as we move through the qualification on what the students are required to do and that level of understanding they're required to demonstrate. You can really see that progression if you look at those ACCA syllabus documents. So as we said earlier, when we looked at examples of blueprints, if you look at the syllabus documents, you'll see that there are different ways to show the educational level. But we use these 3 cognitive levels that you can see on the slide, and each of these are attached to our detailed learning outcomes. So each learning outcome will either be a level 1, knowledge and comprehension, a level 2, application and analysis, or level 3, synthesis and evaluation. So at applied knowledge, they're mostly 1s and 2s. But by the time you get to strategic professional, almost all the learning outcomes are set at level 3, our highest level. And again, we're coming back to this golden rule that we talked about at the start, that there must be an alignment between the syllabus and the exams so that it's predictable what the students expect to see, and they can be well prepared for how they're going to be tested and the depth to which they will be tested. Some of you may have come across Bloom's taxonomy before, which is also mentioned on the slide. We're going to spend a little bit of time now talking about Bloom's taxonomy for those of you that may not have seen this before. So Bloom's taxonomy is a model that originated in the 1950s for classifying educational learning objectives by their level of complexity. Now, I'm sure you will agree there is a lot of writing on this slide, and you'll be really glad to know that I'm not going to talk you through it all in detail today. But as someone has already asked, and I can confirm, we will share the slides after the session today, so you will be able to look at this in more detail in your own time. It's a nice framework to use when creating assessments, and it has lots of examples and good ideas for verbs that you could use in your exam questions to set them at the right level for what you're testing. So we can see here that the simplest category we've got is knowledge. And we're just asking students with knowledge to recall information that they've learned. They don't necessarily need to understand it. They don't need to apply it to a situation. They just need to recall it. For example, in a tax exam, we might say, please list the conditions for rollover relief. Students don't have to know what rollover relief is. They don't have to understand it, they don't have to apply it, they just have to have remembered what all the conditions are. So as you might imagine, that's a lot easier than having to apply it. The next level up is comprehension, where we actually want students to be able to understand what they're writing. So this is expecting more of them than purely just knowledge. If we keep moving up our levels of complexity, we now see that learners are being asked to manipulate information, bringing together different ideas and making complex judgments. So they might be being asked to analyse. So they might be given a problem that they need to solve, or they might be being asked for different outcomes. They might be being asked to evaluate, as we see at the bottom. So giving a conclusion or a recommendation, perhaps, about a certain set of situations. So we can see how we move through from just knowledge of the subject through to actually evaluating and analysing situations. And it's really these sort of higher level skills which we should be focusing on more and more as we move away from MCQs towards the longer case studies and up the levels of the qualification. And it's not to say that we can't test any application or knowledge, but we don't want that to be the main part of the testing in these higher level exams. So let's think about how we write a good case study question, because it's actually quite hard and it does take time. The first step in writing a good one is to think back to the work we did earlier on the assessment strategy, the blueprint and the prescription. All of those questions we asked earlier are equally valid for longer questions as they are for MCQs. And you'll still need things like your rolling syllabus mapping, which allow you to determine the basics of what you're going to test within a particular case study question. So you might want to think about which topics are going to be included, how much of your syllabus is going to be covered by this particular question, because you don't want it to be too wide, but you don't want it just to test something very narrowly either, because if someone doesn't know about that topic, they're going to score very, very poorly. Is it at the right difficulty level for what you're aiming for? Is it going to be consistent with previous exam sessions? Do students know this topic based on what's in the learning materials? And is there any pre-seen material that you need to give the students to support them with these types of questions? So it's worth making sure at this early stage, before you start writing, that everyone involved in the creation process is happy with the plan for the question, because it's much easier to fix that now and make changes if people have got feedback, rather than having a writer write the question out in full and then discovering that someone has issues with it, because it's much harder then to start changing elements of the question or having to rewrite the question as a whole. This is particularly important if you've got new people involved in the process, or you're creating this type of exam for the first time. So assuming we've set out the scenario of our question and we've set out our requirements and everyone's happy, it's now time to turn to writing a full exam question. So this process will take several drafts. So writers need to have patience and also be willing to take feedback on what they've written, because no one's going to get these things perfect first time. When they're writing the questions, it's often best practice to start with the requirements before you write the scenario, so you know what you're trying to do with that scenario, rather than writing the scenario and then trying to come up with questions that you could ask based on it. So start with the requirements and then write the scenario to fit. Some things to think about in terms of best practice, and like we said, some of these are similar to what we saw with multiple choice questions. So first of all, the question needs to be achievable in the time. So we don't want students either finishing it in 10 minutes when we thought it was going to take them half an hour, and we don't want them only getting halfway through the question, even though they're rushing in the allotted time. We want it to be fair in the time that they're given. We want to test a mix of syllabus topics, because as I said earlier, if we test something very, very narrow and some of the students haven't revised that topic, they're not going to be able to do any of it. And if some students get a topic that they're very, very strong at, they could score 100% very easily. So we want to test a mix of topics or mix of areas within a topic, so that there's a good spread of the syllabus being tested, not too much on any one thing. It needs to be realistic, but not necessarily real life, because we know the real world is complicated, and having those complications in an exam doesn't necessarily help the students to demonstrate their knowledge. And the exam world doesn't necessarily need to exactly replicate the real world. I know when I have, say, corporation tax questions, my husband works in corporation tax, and the amount of times I've said to him, well, if this was the scenario, what would happen if you did this, then this, then this? And he just looks at me and says, but that would never happen in reality. And then I get frustrated because he can't tell me the right answer. But all I'm saying is that the exam world doesn't necessarily have to replicate exactly the real world, as long as the students are going to understand what they've been shown, and we've structured the scenario in a way that it is correct. You need to really watch out for what I'm going to call gateway marks. So what can happen is that a mark very early on in a scenario can impact the rest of the question. So for example, we might have a question where students need to decide if a business is a partnership or what's called a limited liability partnership, which for anyone who's not come across these is a corporate partnership. And then the rest of the marks for that question will be different depending on whether they treat this business as a partnership or an LLP being a corporate partnership. So that's what we refer to as a gateway mark. So if students make the wrong decision at that point, they're going to prepare a very different answer to a student that makes the other decision. Or we could have something where if students make one decision, they need to do a calculation, whereas if they make another decision, they don't need to do a calculation at all. And all of these things will cause you problems during marking, and also could really impact the students if they make the wrong decision. So I'd be very, very careful with these gateway marks. And when you're writing the question, you need to think through how will it go if students go wrong? What will they do? And how are you going to mark it? And try to avoid students being able to go off down the wrong path too often with questions. We also need to make sure that the questions are fair for all the candidates. So you need to think about the language used. Will all students understand the terms that have been chosen? Is there anything in there that could be confusing to them? Could we say it in a simpler way? Is there particular words they might not understand? So for instance, when I first started looking after the Lesotho tax exam, I came across a term which was called double cab backy. And I looked at that and I thought, I have absolutely no idea what that is. What's a double cab backy? And when I looked it up, thanks to Google, I realised that it's a pickup truck. So just a truck with a flatbed on the back, which didn't make any sense to me, but to people in Lesotho, that term makes sense and it's fine. So you just need to think about who your students are and will they understand the language being used. It's really important to avoid what we call colloquialisms. So that's sort of local slang that some students might understand and others won't. My best example for this is when I was teaching. It's really easy in English to use the term red herring, which means a distractor, essentially, like we saw earlier. So something that looks like that you need it or looks like the right answer, but actually isn't the right answer. And of course, a herring is a fish. So when you use the term red herring to people that aren't native English speakers, they look at you like you've lost the plot because they don't understand what a red herring is. So we need to be careful to avoid those terms that might confuse people. You also want to avoid certain topics. So we tend to avoid things like politics, religion as well. You might want to avoid things like meat as well, if that could be offensive to the people that are sitting your exam. We definitely don't want anything that's going to upset anybody. We don't want anything that's going to distract people from being able to answer the question. You also really want your exam to be in a predictable format. So you don't want students coming into the exam and being surprised by what they see. I remember a particular university exam that I sat a very long time ago now, and I was told that the exam was going to have 6 questions and you needed to pick 2 to answer. And there was always 2 quite easy questions. So some people just revised the easy topics. And when we got into the exam, there was actually 2 sets of 3 questions and you had to do 1 from each. And the first set were the easy questions and the second set were the hard questions. So you were forced to do one of the hard questions. And you might say, well, students should have revised the whole syllabus, but what they had in advance showed them that they should be able to answer 2 easy questions. So we don't want students having that happen to them. We want them to know what the exam is going to look like and not have any surprises on that on the day. Okay, so we're talking about writing case study questions here, but actually we're missing half of the story. Unfortunately, half of the work when it comes to writing these questions. Really, when we're writing the case study question, so we start with the requirement, we then write the scenario. What we should also be writing at that time is the solution. So by working in this way, there's a much clearer link between the question we're writing and the assessment strategy it's being written under, and this will save an awful lot of potential rework. So when I'm talking about the solution to a case study question, there's actually 3 separate things that we're going to produce, and we're going to talk about each one of these in more detail. There's the mark template, the mark scheme, and the model answer. So by having these produced at the same time that you write the question, that will have three big benefits. So first of all, it's going to assist you in the review of the paper, the exam, because you can't tell if a question is of the right length until you see what the answer is and how many marks are going to be available for it. Because sometimes you read a question and it seems fine, and then you look at the marking guide and you realise there's twice as many marks as there should be, and you can't find any to remove. So actually the question is far too long. It also gives you clarity on where the marks should be awarded before the students sit the exam. And if you've got a team of markers that are going to work on this exam, it gives you consistency between that marking team, that they're all going to mark in the same way because they have this fixed marking scheme to work to. So first of all, the marking template. So really, this is just a list of the available marks in the question and what they're going to be awarded for. So it doesn't have a lot of detail. There'll be space next to each to record the mark awarded for a given student. So it's good to see at a glance what's in the question, particularly for long questions, which may have 50 or 100 marks in total in them. It allows you to see at a glance, for instance, if there's too many knowledge marks, or if someone could pass the question without demonstrating a key skill that you were actually looking to test. You could use Excel to prepare this marking template, and that reduces the risk of arithmetical errors as you go through. The marking scheme is the detailed version of how the marks are going to be awarded, both per point made and also in total, along with any guidance that you want to provide to markers. And this is a real critical step for consistency, either between markers if you have more than one person marking a particular question, or just for that individual marker themselves. Even if it's just you marking that exam, you need a marking scheme so that you know what you're giving the marks for, and crucially what you're not going to give the marks for. And this may change as you go through, because it might be that there's something you haven't thought of and you get to a student's response and you think, oh, I didn't expect them to do that. How am I going to mark it? So you need to make a note of how you mark it so that you can do that for future students as well. So we've got here that there might be some mark restrictions. So you might know that for option 1 there's 4 marks, option 2 there's 6 marks, then students get 2 marks for making a recommendation. But actually, if we add that up, we get to 12 marks, and it might be that there's only 10 marks available overall. So we've actually got more marks available than the student can possibly score. So 12 available, but a maximum of 10. So what that is headroom marks of 2. So 2 more marks available than students could possibly score. Now, some exams have these and some don't. They're more likely in more advanced exams because students can sort of answer the question in different ways, and we want to be able to reward them for whichever way they answer it. But you may have headroom, you may not. It's something that you'd need to decide a policy on whether you're going to do headroom or whether you're going to just have the right amount of marks available for what the students can score. So you'll need to provide notes to your markers to guide them on how to mark the scripts, or to guide yourselves on how to mark the scripts. So we've got an example here. Candidates who list the headings from the model should not be awarded marks. Marks are available only for applying each heading to the scenario. Or candidates should be given credit for relevant points, even if they've not structured these under the model requested. So just guiding the markers on where they should be flexible and where they shouldn't be flexible. If it's a numerical answer and students could make a really common mistake and go wrong, you might want to give markers the alternative calculation and how many marks it's worth to help them be consistent with those common mistakes. Finally, we've got our model answer. sometimes known as the illustrative answer. So what this should be is equivalent to what a good student could be expected to produce. It is not the single right answer, but is a good illustration of what we're expecting a good candidate to do. And it can also help future candidates to prepare for their own exam by seeing what's expected of them. Now, it's really important that markers need to understand that it's the marking scheme that they use to mark and not the model solution, albeit the model solution could be used to help them understand the marking scheme. For example, the marking scheme may allow credit for good points, which aren't actually included in the model answer because we didn't expect students to know it, but we think it deserves credit if they do. And students are also likely not need to write their points as fully as the model answer in order to score a mark. We often get students saying about ACCA answers, oh, it's so detailed, there's no way I could write that in the time. And the answer is they don't necessarily need to write it in the time the way that is written. They could generally write it in a shorter way, and they don't necessarily need to get all of those points to score full marks. And it's really important that students understand that. Okay, moving on to a different area, whether it's multiple choice questions or case study questions, as we talked through earlier, the importance of the questions being reviewed before they're sat by students. We also talked right at the start in the exam creation section about this being an iterative process, a circular process. So I wanted to just touch on the importance of the improvement element before we finish up today. So each body or institution needs to come up with its own review process, and this will vary depending on the types of exams you're creating and who you want to have involved in the process, and also who will be signing off on those final exams. It's useful to create a flow diagram like the one we looked at the start, so that you know all of the steps and you're making sure that you're using those exams to improve future sessions of that same exam. It's really important to have a clear audit trail showing the review points and any changes you've made to the exam during the review process, so that you can look back if there are any issues or you can use it to improve. This is particularly important if you're subject to any sort of external governance or regulatory scrutiny. So the typical review stages that you might have are a technical review. So that should happen before the exam is sat by students, because obviously we want to make sure that the exam is as correct as it can be before the students see it, to make sure it's fair. But also you'll probably find there are technical review elements that happen after the student has sat the exam. So that may be that you review the exam yourself again. It might be that some of the students do something that you're not expecting and you need to have another look just to check that it's technically correct. And you might have stakeholders that feed back into your exam. So you might have learning providers who look at it. You might have other tutors that look at it and give you technical feedback on the exam itself. Now, that could impact your marking, but it can also impact future sessions of the exam in the way that a question is asked or the way the answer is written. You're probably going to have a time test. So again, as part of your review process before students sit the exam, you're probably going to want someone to sit that exam to time to make sure that it's reasonable within the time that you've given and it's not too long or too short. But you're also going to think about time once the students have sat the exam as well, and whether it felt time pressured or whether it felt too easy for the time or whether it was reasonable. You're going to possibly get feedback on your exam from lots of different sources. That might be from students, it could be from other tutors, it could be from learning providers, it could be from regulators, and it's really important to use that feedback to improve future exams, as well as making sure that these students get a fair result. You might have regulatory reviews or the sign off by someone within your organisation of the exam itself. And you might have an exam panel that consider all of the information that you can gather about that exam in order to make sure that the results given are fair. One of the really key ways to provide feedback on the exam is through something called an examiner's report. And it's really a two-way process between those setting the exams and those sitting them. And a key way that we can feed back to the students is by giving them a report. It's a good way to pass feedback to learners and give them insights and knowledge that will help those who failed to resit and be successful, but also it's invaluable to those sitting in the future to see where others struggled and to help them prepare effectively for their own exam. It's also really useful for those providing tuition towards the exam to understand where students are weaker, where they're stronger, and how they can help their students to pass. It could be accompanied by other support, so there could be webinars to debrief the exam. It could provide links to study resources if perhaps there was a particular area that students struggled with. And you could hold an Ask the Examiner session where students could ask questions about the exam that's just been sat. It's really important with this to remember to keep the tone of the report positive. It's so easy if students have done badly to get frustrated, and without meaning to, you write a report where those frustrations really come through. But that's not going to help the students that have failed or future students who weren't part of that exam at all. So we really want to keep the report in a positive language rather than being overly critical of students that haven't done well. And as we can see here, if we seek feedback from students who've sat the exam and those involved in the writing and reviewing of exams and other key stakeholders such as tuition providers, we can use that to inform future exams and make them better and fairer, and really help the students to demonstrate the knowledge and skills that we want them to be able to demonstrate. So we could get feedback on the exam creation process, which is likely to come from our own team, the assessment format and strategy, the style of the exam, communications or study resources, or the exam day experience. Now, students will often say that an exam was too long or too hard, and especially when you've written that exam and you feel really attached to it, it's easy to discount this as them just not being prepared. But it's really important to think about the big picture. Think about all the information that you have to do with that exam. So if students are saying it's too long or too hard, you'll want to look at the responses and say, is there any evidence that it was time pressured? Is there any evidence that it was too hard? Have they performed less well than they did before? Or is it just that they weren't prepared on that particular topic? So we should always try to establish whether the student feedback is fair or not. If assessment content is being reused, for example, with banks, you could use feedback to update the content. Otherwise, if you're creating new content every time, it's important to make sure the writers are given any useful feedback so that they're able to input that when they write questions again in the future. Oh, that was an awful lot of information. I hope that you found it useful. So we started off talking about the exam creation process. We then talked about assessment strategies and how to structure an exam. We then talked about how to write effective multiple choice questions, how to write effective case study questions, and we've just done a little bit on exam review processes and improvement. So, as I said, an awful lot to cover in 90 minutes. I'm very happy to cover any questions that anybody might have for the remainder of the session. I can't see anything in the chat box, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to either come off of mute and hopefully SL can translate for me, or put them in the chat box.
Yes, and there are no questions so far. Дорогие участники, если у вас есть вопросы, пожалуйста, задавайте. Very informative presentation. Thanks a lot, Daniel.
And thank you for writing in English for me. I've learned today what thank you is in Russian. I can't pronounce it, but I can recognize it in the chat box now. So thank you.
Yeah. So if
Okay.
nobody is writing, no, I think no one is writing.
Okay.
In this
Okay.
case, we will take it as a no. And thank you very much for your time.
Right.
Thank you very, very much for the presentation and it was very informative.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time today.
And they say I have learned many things. Thank you. Thank you. So enjoy the rest of the day. Спасибо большое, дорогие участники. Всем хорошего дня. Мы вам вышлем запись, также и презентации с обоих дней. Если у вас будут вопросы, пожалуйста, задавайте, пишите. Вы все получили от меня и вчера, и сегодня сообщения, поэтому у вас есть мой email. Пожалуйста, пишите. Thank you. Bye, Daniel.
Bye-bye.